this year. Back in January, we laid out our strategic goals for 2020, and how things have changed. We have ditched our entire strategic plan for the year and set forth a focus back at the end of March, focused purely on COVID-19 related issues. And all of our staff have been deeply engaged and focused on that. Although we are spread to all of our remote locations, have been working nonstop throughout this to try to help businesses in the economy through this. I want to say a couple of things that I'd like to just call your attention to about where we are today, and urgent messages that I think are important with respect to COVID-19, but also with respect to our economic disparities. One, we are 7 days away from the end of the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, which expires for new applications on June 30th. So I would really encourage anyone listening to this or reading the stories or watching TV coverage of this interview to pursue a PPP loan if you have not done so. This is effectively free money from the federal government in the form of a forgivable business loan. We have heard from most small businesses we have talked to that it is the #1 most important lifeline to their businesses throughout this period. We also, as I'm going to talk about in a minute, see economic disparities in access to that program. And so if for any reason you feel like you haven't been able to get one because of your current banking relationship, that should not be a reason not to take advantage of one. Reach out to us or call others who are taking on new clients in order to get a PPP loan before that deadline. We'd encourage the media partners watching this to push that coverage and reporting this week. It's a high priority to make sure that everyone who hasn't considered it, reconsidered it, or consider it for the first time to try to take advantage of it. The second thing to highlight is that we are about 5 weeks away from the end of the pandemic unemployment insurance. This has been the supplemental $600 bonus from the federal government that has really been a huge part of the safety net to families who have been unemployed during this period. We're going to talk more about that, but we really want everybody to be paying attention to what happens to their family income, their individual income, what jobs or opportunities are out there for them, and how can they find ways to make sure that they have some sort of resource for them and their families after the pandemic unemployment insurance ends. We'll talk more about that, but those two timelines, the clocks are ticking on those two things. Wanted to make sure we started out by saying that issue. Let me see if these slides will advance. We've been laying out, I want to just talk a little bit about the economy before going into the data of disparity in Metro Baton Rouge. We've been seeing the period of the economy as in 3 phases. First has been that crisis period of the first 2 or 3 months between March and May. And that was really a focus of our work that focused on getting data out about programs, advocacy for workers and businesses, making sure that stakeholders were able to share information to businesses. And we reached out to over 2,000 businesses for a one-on-one outreach phone call to try to help them get access to information and to check on their status. Last week, we released a new statement looking at our focus for our work for the next 2 to 5 months. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. And we expect in time, hopefully by this fall, we'll be able to get to what we think is the new normal of our economic development work. And we expect that the work of economic development will be substantially different coming out of this than it was at the very beginning, what we shared with you when we came in to talk to the press club back in January. Just a few data slides about the status of the economy. We've seen a slight pickup in small business hourly employment. This has really been the biggest segment of the economy where we've seen job losses has been those hourly employees at businesses. You can see that the recovery in Ascension Parish is looking a little better than where it is for East Baton Rouge and Livingston Parish. We think this is an important indicator to track to see when we start to see employment levels recovering. It's going to be at small businesses where we will see the biggest impact and we think the slowest recovery. And again, why we come back to emphasizing so much the importance of the Paycheck Protection Program, really singularly focused at small businesses. We have seen a downward trajectory in residential travel as the data indicates that we have in front of you. This is Google's mobility data on the right-hand slide, somewhere between 20 and 30% decline still in folks that are driving to work from their home, their residence, which Google is using that by tracking mobile phones to track mobility. We can see a lot different picture of who's going to the grocery store or is heading out to shop at retail or going out for recreation. And so while we've seen some rebound, you can see in this Google mobility data that we still are substantially down in terms of our overall mobility as a community. On the ridership data for CATS, you can see the most recently available data on the left. CATS is still down over 50% in terms of ridership from pre-COVID, from the 2019 levels. So folks still very cautious about getting out. Unemployment in Baton Rouge, metro area is 9 parish areas, right? The 9 parish area has about 57,000 people on the continued unemployment insurance claims in the metro area. That's a huge number, a 2,600% increase over what it was like on March 14th. That week, we saw 2,000 folks on unemployment. The economy was clicking along, and then everything related to COVID-19 has hit us. And I'll show you what that trend line looks like. It is not necessarily tailing downward. It's essentially plateaued for right now. Hotel occupancy data has trended upward, but is still substantially off. And the revenue being reported from that occupancy is down more than the number of people in their hotel rooms. So they're having to discount rooms substantially in order to get folks into them. And so that's creating a real significant impact. We just had at 11 o'clock a webinar for the hospitality community to try to share more information about how travel is being impacted during this. Just to go back to hotel occupancy and unemployment, you can see where phase 1 and phase 2 come in on each of these two. The regional economy was beginning to recover before we hit the May 15th first phase of the stay-at-home order. If you look back to the first chart, you'd see the same thing on the data we showed about small business employment. But as you can see on the weekly combined unemployment insurance claims, it is not trending downward as you'd like to be seeing. That as we got to those phase 1 and phase 2 moments, that we saw, folks starting to leave unemployment insurance, and that's not what you're seeing. It feels like it's plateaued. It actually last week, it slightly clicked upward. So it feels like it's hit a stagnant point for the economy overall for those that are on unemployment insurance. Now, during the first phase, this is just a picture of what we were doing in our economic development work. I highlighted that at the very beginning. We wanted to be very structured in our efforts. And I show you this to mainly show you that last week we really entered the work phase of what BRAC is going to be doing for the next few months. Aggressively trying to focus on those efforts that will help get people back into jobs, beating back unemployment. If folks have not been able to find access to our BR Works program, our initiative to find those employers that have open job opportunities, we've had 109 different businesses list job openings that they have available on our website, BR Works. We encourage folks to go take a look at that. There will be more to come in those efforts. We've also begun thinking about what happens when we get to the new normal and how business development and economic development are going to work. The after COVID economy may involve new opportunities for investment for companies trying to reshore parts of their supply chain, recognizing how many were unable to get supplies to their manufacturing facilities or their services because of what happened when travel was shut down, global travel was shut down during COVID-19. I'm going to speak about our strategy around racial disparities in a minute. We also are still doing quite a lot of weekly work around actionable intelligence for businesses to be able to better understand the state of the economy, like I just went through a moment ago. And then what we have found more than anything is getting information out to the business community, to the media community. Reliable information is still hugely important for businesses to be able to understand what's happening. And that continues to change every week as new guidance comes out about the Paycheck Protection Program or about unemployment insurance, or about the next wave of federal action that we can expect, or some of the legal liability protections that have been provided by the state legislature, or the new Main Street grant program that the treasurer is about to launch. There are many different things coming out each week that still affect employers, and we're going to continue to be a reliable source of information that gets that out to the business community. Now, coming to the issues of disparity in our community, we put out a statement on June 5th recognizing that that what's happening in the United States and in Metro Baton Rouge right now is an important reevaluation of where we are as a community with regard to the disparities that exist for Blacks in our community, the disparities between Blacks and whites in our community, the disparities between Black-owned businesses and white-owned businesses in our community. and trying to understand that better has been something we think is an important priority for ours. As it turned out, we had started down that path before COVID-19. We every 5 years, we do a new 5-year strategic plan for BRAC, and in doing so, we bring in an outside partner to help us look at our competitiveness as a metro Baton Rouge area compared to other places. So we had started down that path, and right when COVID-19 started, we really put all that research on pause, but fortunately we'd gotten a lot of it already. So what I want to share with you today is what we found through that early research, especially with regard to the issues of economic inclusion. To do that, we actually worked with Ernst & Young, a group that does economic development advisory services for Ernst & Young, has been working with us. They're one of the best in the nation, with nearly every large metro area out there to look at their economic development strategies. They looked, as you can see in this map, at about a 1,000-mile area, looking at areas with a population of 400,000 to 2 million within that 1,000-mile area. And so you get this map of cities. So we took the data of those 39 other metropolitan areas, and we're comparing that to the data for the Baton Rouge area. And we gathered over 80 different indicators on a lot of different categories. The ones we're going to share with you today just have to do with issues of economic inclusion. So I wanted to show you just some of the indicators were broad indicators. This is not a disparity or inclusion data point, it's just a general indicator of looking at 40 other metros. Are you in the top 25% or the bottom 25%? Where you fall? This one happens to look at employment growth of Metro Baton Rouge compared to the other 40 metros between the years 2013 and 2018. So we were right at the bottom 25% on total employment growth at 4.5% growth. What we saw during that period is explosive employment growth in the United States, a prolonged period of economic expansion. For the makeup of our industry clusters that we have in Baton Rouge, we did not see as rapid a rate of economic growth overall as other metros do. I show you this just to be able to share with you that this is a broader set of indicators we were trying to look at, and we're going to be sharing more of those as we go. We also looked at something of establishment growth. So how many new firms were being created in Baton Rouge during that same period? So while we saw 4.5% employment growth, we actually saw we were in the top 50% for new firm creation. So a lot of entrepreneurial activity. We ranked 17th among the 40 for this indicator. We'd love to be at the top end of both of these categories. This is just to give you a status check of where we were. So that helps you get a framework of how this works. The next two slides I want to take you through are really to look at the inclusion, the economic access of our community relative to the others. The first to start with is the topic of poverty. So most folks will probably Googled or looked up that our overall poverty rate is about 16.8%. The question that we asked Ernst & Young to look at is a deeper point of this, which is those that are in poverty and employed. So it may be counterintuitive for folks to think of it this way, but what we recognize is those communities who are actually seeing ways to elevate folks out of poverty are doing so by making sure that when they do have access to employment, that they're actually able to move out of poverty in doing so. We see that in Metro Baton Rouge, we are in the top 50% in this category. When folks are able to get into employment, it is helping them get out of poverty. Less than 7% of Baton Rouge area residents that are employed for at least 6 months or longer are in poverty. So it gives you a sense of how we're doing. We're about 19th among the study group that we looked at. On housing affordability, this actually is a statistic that looks not at affordability, but what is the cost burden of households relative to housing. So we know when it comes to poverty, one of the big factors is whether the population of those that are spending more than 30% of their household income are spending that on housing costs, whether that's on a mortgage for a house they own or on their rent. So about 37% of homeowners or renters in Baton Rouge spend more than 30% of their housing costs, their income on housing costs. It's in the bottom 50%, but we're sort of in the middle on this indicator, as you can see. But it is one of those factors that has a lot to do with helping folks move out of poverty and make sure that they can invest more of their household income on education or other things necessary for their families. We also wanted to look at the data on the poverty rates of households. So you can see here in this data point that the ratio of non-white families relative to their poverty rate to those that are white households in poverty is about 2.3%. Again, we're around the middle of this, although we're in the bottom 50% for this category. It's one that gives an indication of the gap between white households who are in poverty. The poverty rate is around 10% for white non-Hispanic households, whereas for all other racial and ethnic groups, the poverty rate exceeds 20%. And it's that gap that is highlighted for this economic indicator. The next one actually starts to drill into household income and racial disparities. This indicator looks at the factors of household gaps. So the chart that you're seeing, this is perhaps the most stark for Metro Baton Rouge. We're at the bottom end of the spectrum for this gap between household income. So white non-Hispanic household income is at about $75,000 for median household income. For Hispanic households at around $58,000. For Black households, it's at about $38,000. And it's in that gap that you're seeing such a stark difference in the haves and have-nots of our communities. And so while we saw in the earlier slide the gap of those that are in poverty who are employed, this just shows the overall household income disparity is enormous in our community. So what this frames is the issue of wealth creation, especially for Black households, as well as increased income is a big factor of this. What are the opportunities for Black households, as well as Hispanic or other non-Black, non-white households to be able to increase their opportunities for their families? A lot of that, of course, comes to education. We're going to share this slide in just a moment. We actually looked at this in a slide we shared late last year in our economic indicators. We showed that over the last 10 years, Black household income growth actually rose faster than white households. But the pace of change over the last five years has slowed. If you look at the chart on the left, you can see it as a 10-year picture, the growth for Black households there in the gray chart exceeding those of other households. But that change, that rate of increase has slowed as of the most recent data, 5 years, it's actually different. So something that was looking promising on a 10-year set of data has actually slowed in the more recent years. And we have to expect that COVID-19 is going to set that back even further. When we comes to another indicator we asked Ernst & Young to pull was on educational attainment. This is a ratio between white non-Hispanic households and non-white households for those that have a bachelor's degree who are age 25 or older. The gap is 1.7%. We're in the bottom 25% for this indicator. While 34% of white households in Baton Rouge, in the metro area of Baton Rouge, possess a bachelor's degree, only 20% of non-white households have a bachelor's degree in their household. So it gives you a sense of where we are. Again, this is a college attainment indicator. We'd love to continue to drill into this data and show what that looks like when you get into two-year associate's degrees and other indicators, and the connection between the attainment of either a two-year associate's or a bachelor's degree and rates of income for those households. Another one that we found to be quite stark was the percentage of non-white households in management positions. Ever since we started our Diversity in Business Summit 4 years ago, now 5 years ago, we've been highlighting the issue of what this looks like to try to focus on management positions being diversely held. So this ratio that you're seeing on this chart, where we are at 51%, shows the percentage of non-white workers in management positions relative to the total non-white population. So if Baton Rouge has roughly a 40% of its region's population that is non-white, we should expect to see that roughly the percentage of non-white management positions would look around the same at 40%. Well, we're about half of that. We're at 51% of that number that are in management positions. Just 20% of workers in management positions today are non-white in the Baton Rouge area. So that gives you a significant picture of the gap. A lot of that has to do with the diversity strategies within companies, something we've been emphasizing over the last 4 years of our Diversity in Business Summit. 2 years ago, we launched an award called the Diversity Star Award to really recognize companies that are showing leadership in this. If you look at those communities on the right-hand side, upper right-hand side, that are doing the best on this indicator, interestingly, 2 of them are ones that we know happen to have quite a lot of Fortune 500 companies that have significant strategies around corporate and management diversity. Of course, in Arkansas and Fayetteville, we've seen that in work that's been happening at Walmart and other corporations. And in Nashville, a lot of headquartered healthcare companies that have put a lot of strategy and focus on this issue. For women in management, again, a stark difference on this indicator. You'll see kind of where we stand as a community on 38% roughly of women in management positions, in the bottom 50% on that indicator. That also then affects the earnings ratio between the median female earnings as a percent of the median male earnings, which were the bottom end of the spectrum on this indicator. The pay equity by gender is a significant gap in Metro Baton Rouge as well. This slide is to show you all of what I just took you through in one picture. So you can see on this chart all of those indicators and our ranking down the center. And then of the 40 metro areas, those dots you see to the right, where Baton Rouge as a metro area fell. So when you see it all in one picture, you see just how starkly off we are as a metro Baton Rouge area. And you might be looking at this and thinking to yourself, I think this is a terrible moral injustice for where we are as a community. What I would tell you is it's not just a challenge for us from the moral standpoint of what's right and what's fair as a community. It also has a lot to do with our opportunities for economic development in the Metro Baton Rouge area. We asked Ernst & Young to plot it out and compare it in a correlation analysis to the other factor that I started with for employment growth. And when you look at all of the indicators that we went through for economic inclusion, you plot out the metro areas that we were comparing ourselves to, and then you put it against the factor of the last 5 years of employment growth. What this shows is a strong correlation between those communities who have more inclusive opportunities for all people in their economy, and that it also happens to also be important for propelling growth in those communities, attracting business, and attracting and retaining talent for those communities. I think this chart, perhaps more than any, indicates that this is an important factor for economic development for our community to be paying attention to when you see just how far off we are from the upper end of those that saw much more rapid levels of growth. I want to end by talking about things that we should be doing right now, what we called attention to in our statement on June 5th, are ways that we all can be leaning in to try to make sure that where we are in COVID-19 is also addressing the racial disparities that exist in the economy for Baton Rouge today. One, as I started with, making sure that all businesses, but minority-owned businesses especially, are being connected with access to PPP loans and other access to capital initiatives that are being launched. Second is to do more to find and develop data on the impact of COVID-19 on Black-owned businesses and other minority-owned businesses. The data does not exist nationally. It does not exist in the state of Louisiana or regionally, something we're going to try to do some work on to try to identify the disparity of impact that we've seen in healthcare outcomes. Is it also happening in minority-owned enterprises? Next, we've heard from a lot of companies during this last few weeks that are wanting to set up diversity initiatives for their companies to help them be more inclusive internally. And so we've been working through our diversity and inclusion committee to help identify ways that we can coach companies on being more intentional about their internal corporate diversity programs, something that can lead to higher rates of management diversity, for example. We've also said, and I call attention to this today for those that are listening, we want to help more businesses talk about race and racial injustices within their companies by partnering with the Dialogue on Race. We're willing to do some cost sharing, and we want to help identify companies who want to reach out and set up those dialogues. We've had a good response from our initial outreach. We can continue to encourage that again today. We were going to continue doing more around procurement opportunities and Black-owned businesses in Baton Rouge. Over the last year, since we've been running the BR-POP program, the Procurement Opportunity Partnership, we've had 45 companies reach out and have access to procurement offerings that were made by larger businesses in Metro Baton Rouge that are looking to procure services from local minority-owned businesses and disadvantaged businesses. For those who are hearing this today, I'd encourage them to reach out to us if they're a large business and they would like to participate. We're welcoming more companies. We saw a few come in over the last 2 weeks. We're now at just shy of about 20 large businesses that are procuring services through this partnership. And we've seen that partnership with Metromorphosis continue to grow as Black-owned businesses reach out to be able to offer services that are available for procurement. Lastly is through our economic development work. We want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to drive reinvestment into disadvantaged communities. And economic development and our work has continued to prioritize more sites for development, more opportunities for development, and supporting existing businesses in disadvantaged communities to make sure that we're helping work through how we can help support economic investment in those communities, as well as working with programs like Build Baton Rouge to make sure that there are strategies around neighborhood revitalization and driving economic opportunity. We think these are important during the disaster recovery phase that we're in, as well as what we've been focused on for a long time around diversity and inclusion issues as well. So that's kind of some of the priorities we've set forth, some of the data we've shared. I want to continue to emphasize how we're going to be a very intentional organization about focusing on this. And we know that we are on our own development progress and our path as an organization, that we have a lot of work still to do, but we're going to try to make more strides for ourselves to continue to get better at this. And we do that by listening. We do that by taking advice from the community, from our investors, and making sure we're responding to the moment and we're in, and trying to make sure that this economy recovers strong out of COVID-19. With that, let me pause and Karen, turn back to you to see if there are questions for me.
Okay, so if you have a question for Adam, if you could just let me know via chat that you want to ask a question, and then I'll recognize you and you can ask Adam your question. All right, Scotty Hunter has a question.
Yes, I do. Adam, I know you talked a little bit about kind of prioritizing some Black-owned businesses and even maybe some economic opportunities in disadvantaged parts of our community. Are there any specific things that you can speak to maybe in North Baton Rouge? Because I know that's one of the things that we hear a lot of time. People say that it's not an invested area, and they want to really know how we can attract businesses to come there and stay there.
Yeah, it's a great question, Scotty. So a few things. One, the North Baton Rouge Economic Development District has been our closest partner for working on this. We've had a standing monthly call to make sure that our work and their work remain connected. Jerry Jones, who runs that program, is a good partner to us to make sure that there are projects we can work on. A few of the ways we're thinking about this. One is every time we have an opportunity where there is a request for proposals for a company looking for a site to locate in Metro Baton Rouge, every opportunity we can, we're making sure when we have a site that matches their availability in North Baton Rouge, we're trying to make sure that we know those sites and are submitting those sites at every available opportunity. Second is we've been engaged in an ongoing conversation about how to make sure that we sort of close the gap on a food desert in North Baton Rouge. Probably the most significant area of focus that Mayor Broome has made a focus on is trying to align on how to recruit grocery store access in North Baton Rouge. We're a part of the project team being led by the mayor's office and by Hope Credit Union to try to push forward incentives to grocery stores to make sure that they locate, not just to create jobs, but also to create access to healthy food choices in North Baton Rouge. Third is going out and contacting existing businesses. Scotty, for where we are right now is as I've emphasized a few times, if there's a Black-owned business or a minority-owned business in North Baton Rouge who have not taken advantage of so many of these federal programs, they're probably going to be at a higher rate for closure or bankruptcy. So what we're trying to do is making sure that they have every access afforded to them to get access to the PPP in the next 7 days. Again, I encourage media to do a push for the next 7 days to help identify businesses that could take advantage of that program who still haven't. And then after that, making sure that all of the other available programs out there are pushed out to them. We're going to be coming out with something, Scotty, in the next few days to explain what we know today about what the state is going to offer through the Main Street program that was just approved by the legislature. They're taking some of the CARES Act to create a $300 million business grant program to those businesses that have not availed themselves of federal assistance. That could be up to $15,000 grants out to businesses. So then we have the obligation as a region to make sure that we do everything we can to make sure that that word gets out to our businesses, to make sure that that lifeline of financial assistance gets out to them. So those gives you some examples of the things that we think are high priorities right now to make sure that we're doing to make sure there's investment opportunity. There are other things that are happening outside of our sphere that we're supportive of. Build Baton Rouge has been focused on a reinvestment strategy along Plank Road as an example. Those remain high priorities. We're going to continue to push for identifying sites for reinvestment, that we have more ways to push investment as well into those communities. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
I believe Holly has a question.
Yes, hi. I was wondering, Adam, what your reaction is to Gary Chambers calling out BRAC for supporting the renaming of Lehigh, but not calling for the resignation of Connie Bernard.
Yeah, so appreciate the question. We've been talking about it internally since last week's actions. Last week our priority was focusing on Lee High School. That happened on Thursday. We came out strongly in favor of the renaming of Lee High School before the meeting of the vote. We were happy to see a unanimous recommendation of the school board to make that renaming occur, a process that's going to unfold in the coming months. What we know for where we are is this: the school board does not have the power to remove her. And so given that, it's going to be something that's going to be called upon for the school board to have a discussion about whether they want to lean in and push their voice forward about her role, her continued role on that board. Either she can choose to resign herself, or there can be some form of a recall petition from her constituents to drive that recall process, right? So that's the two ways this is going to happen. If I lived in her district right now, just as me, I would be asking myself as a parent, as a taxpayer, do I think she can be effective representing me, my children, my neighbors after everything she's done over the last few years? And while BRAC doesn't endorse candidates, we have a political action committee that does look at candidates on an election cycle. I will say that BRAC, or I should say the Future PAC, our political action committee, has not endorsed or supported Connie Bernard in the past. And so I'd expect this is going to be something that we continue to talk about. For where we are, though, I'd say I want to come back to this. We're pleased to see that the community has been so engaged in holding its elected officials accountable, and that they're starting to come together, as we saw last week on Lee High School, to address issues of inequity in our community. I think that's something that we want to continue to emphasize, is this be an ongoing conversation that we all continue to have. BRAC is going to remain engaged in these conversations, and we're going to be talking about the issue of the school board member Connie Bernard over the coming weeks.
Thanks.
Robert, do you want to ask your question? So, Adam?
Yes.
So Robert, Scott had a question. What can we learn from other metro areas that are doing, what can we learn about from other metro areas, what they're doing with these metrics that we're not, basically, so that they're
Yes.
better?
That's a great question. So we, as part of our 5-year planning, we're actually at the point when COVID-19 hit of asking our team that's helping us on researching other metro areas. We were actually at the phase of data discovery, and that usually is, then you move on to the next phase, which is how can we learn from the practices of other places to improve our ways. A few ways we've been doing that. Last year, for our Diversity in Business Summit that we had in May 2019, we invited leaders from the Cincinnati Chamber of Commerce to come in and share some of their best practices for diversity and inclusion. And so through that, excuse me, my slides just freaked out there. Through that, we've been actually doing a lot of work to try to do our own discovery before our 5-year planning. With the organization we're working with at Ernst & Young, we hope to discover other ones. A few things that we've seen that they do very well that we've already launched. Many of the places we've looked at have very strong procurement programs where they partner with businesses to try to help them have a private sector to private sector increase in transactions. From the work that we did in the last 12 months, we saw $5 million in contracts awarded to disadvantaged minority-owned businesses here in Baton Rouge through that first year of the procurement partnership. We are just excited to see what 1 year of effort has accomplished, and we want to know that we can continue to increase that effort as more businesses partner with us for their procurement opportunities, and then we're able to find more disadvantaged businesses to connect them to. That was a very significant thing that we saw from Cincinnati that they made a lot of strides on. We've also seen that they've done a lot around how to help companies set up diversity programs that focus on ways that they become more intentional in their hiring practices. So as I said a minute ago, one of the things we've seen as a best practice already is that they've been at this a much longer period of time working on how to help businesses be more intentional about setting up internal diversity programs and measuring the outcomes of those programs. The third area actually has a lot to do with reinvestment in disadvantaged communities, the ability for the business community to leverage the balance sheet of the community to drive reinvestment, not just for philanthropic purposes, but to try to drive reinvestment as a way to increase market opportunities. And if we've seen that when you can create investment opportunities that also go back to driving reinvestment in disadvantaged neighborhoods, you're able to take the wealth of the community to drive change. And that's what we also saw in other places that had very organized redevelopment efforts as they focused on that as well.
Okay, Scotty had another question.
Yeah, I did. Adam, I know one of the things that stood out to me was the dialogue on race. That was one of the things that you said you guys were interested in promoting to other businesses in the community, making sure that they do that and that it's facilitated. Do you think that'll be enough to really change hearts and minds, though, or is it just kind of a first step? Because as we've seen, there are a lot of people, not just here, but in other places, where maybe they're in positions of authority, in positions of power. They present themselves publicly one way, and then maybe their text messages or their social media accounts, posts like that, just don't match.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts, and our thought of this, Scotty, was that it starts by beginning conversations internally within companies to set the table for those conversations. We've heard an increased interest in the last month, the last 3 weeks, that more businesses want to be more intentional about fostering these conversations. It was the reason, Scotty, we started the Diversity in Business event 4 years ago. We recognized that we have to make space for these conversations that are difficult conversations in a business setting historically in Baton Rouge, and that if we don't create the openness for that dialogue, it won't occur. And so what we're trying to do as our organization is to create the space and encourage the space for that conversation, and trying to give businesses tools to understand how to do that. We know that this is going to be a long way, and we're at the very beginning of that. We also wanted to emphasize that the Dialogue on Race program is a valuable way to do it. So it wasn't just trying to say that we think it's an important thing to do. We also wanted to say, and in Baton Rouge, we are lucky that there exists a nonprofit that supports this purpose. Not many communities have anything like what Maxine Crump and Dialogue on Race is offering. And so we are fortunate to have access to that program to be able to set those conversations up. But as you allude to, we think it's going to be a long way from here to a place where organizations and individual citizens have been able to get through a place where they have the ability to have these conversations more comfortably. They're more intentional around it. And that intentionality then spreads to their employment practices, their awareness of their own biases, as well as ways to utilize their procurement and investment power to drive opportunity and to drive change for our community. So it's through those dialogues as a start that we think that we can begin to drive additional change. But it is only a beginning, and we thought a hopeful and helpful way to start it.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up to that, if I may. We've seen people removed from positions of authority who maybe have, damning text messages or damning social media posts. Do you think that is an appropriate step? Or, I know a lot of people feel one way or the other about cancel culture, as it's called.
Yeah, I think it is you're seeing that employers are very aware, more aware perhaps than they have been in the past. They're becoming more aware, which is important, of their language through this, and that awareness of their presence and their language and the language that their employees use become a representation of them. And so that awareness, I think, is going to drive a more intentional culture within business and by business about how they speak. I think it's also, Scotty, to recognize how many companies have felt compelled to talk about diversity and inclusion in the last 3 weeks. I think it's interesting to go and look across Metro Baton Rouge at how many businesses and nonprofits felt that it was important to make a statement about where they are as a business on issues of inclusivity and on race. And I think just that awareness is something that hasn't existed before, that you've seen businesses respond at the local level as well as nationally so aggressively to say where they are as a business. And I think that has a lot to do with their intentionality around keeping their employees accountable to the language they use. I know a lot of employers have told us they are having this conversation about how to make sure that they are intentional about their language, that they're going to be mindful of the language that they use, and they're going to be mindful of seeing the language that their employees use to make sure that they represent the corporate culture that their business has.